Thank you. I will read a shorter version of the paper. We have only 1 hour time, and that's why only the first steps of the phenomenology, the chapters on consciousness and self-consciousness, only this first part of the way. The other part you can read in this paper. We have their copies of the paper. That's why only the first part. Philosophy of consciousness. Hegel described the phenomenology as a journey of discovery. This project, this long path of formation to knowledge and the hard struggle of conceptual thinking. Hegel examined his own work harshly and without presupposition. Prejudices relentlessly demanded proof of himself and considered everything carefully before drawing any conclusion. He questioned now the orthodox model of thought, the old paradigm. He attacked it directly now. He was working to overcome, that's the main goal of the phenomenology, to overcome the paradigm of consciousness. And consciousness is duality, it's dualism. Is this Verstand, the understanding. The philosophy of consciousness was still preaching that there was knowledge of truth only of the temporal and the transient. Abandoning the truth, Hegel said, was in scandalous way called the greatest achievement of spirit by the philosophy of consciousness. Yet Jacobi's oath of revelation went, no mortal eye should lift itself to the face of God. This is Jacobi, not Hegel. Kantian critical philosophy had the mentality, of setting boundaries of thinking. Boundaries. This is one point of Hegel's critique. True knowledge was seen as presumption, as arrogance. Despite being far inferior to Hegel, such gatekeepers and border guards of knowledge proclaim to this day that they have left Hegel behind them. For this purpose, the prologue of the phenomenology remains relevant. The nine-headed monster of the philosophy of consciousness is still alive. The cacophony of taking things to be true is making an enthusiastic comeback also in these days. Also back in fashion is, and more, is logical mathematical axiomatics, which calls itself philosophical knowledge, but nurtures lifeless, colorless formalisms and analytical schemes, which are like crystal clear accounts of a spy traitor's affairs. Others fall back on relativism, which is the core of the philosophy of consciousness, which is to say of terrible philosophy. Today you have this knowledge, and tomorrow you have another knowledge, and so on, and so on. This terrible relativism. No knowledge, no science. People who take these routes to refute Hegel say he peddles old-fashioned metaphysics onto theology, and Hegel claims too much. I come to the goals of the phenomenology. Hegel was completely dismantling philosophy and putting a new system of thought in its place. But this had to be thoroughly argued and systematically presented. It should be accounted for in the way that Aristotle meant, and its claim to knowledge should be harshly examined. There were three main things on the agenda of the phenomenology. At first, the formation of consciousness towards knowledge, towards comprehensive thinking, to be carried out in a step-by-step way through knowledge itself. The presentation of apparent knowledge in its complete shape, the path of consciousness being the path of the apparent phenomenal spirit to spirit as conceptual thinking. And third, this third goal is, in Hegel's word, self-fulfilling skepticism. Hegel was not playing here with images and metaphors. For him, knowledge meant the enforcement of the cold necessity of the concept, not images and not metaphors. Only in a pedagogical sense is it okay. In the Aristotelian and Fichtean sense of the original beginning, as well as logical derivation, the deduction in the form of the deduction of the concept of pure knowledge, so Hegel. Deduction. Instead of a history of forms of consciousness, Hegel was showing the development of a necessary and complete mode of conceptual thinking. Geist, phenomenology of Geist, of spirit. Spirit appears in so many different ways that it looks like a chaos. A new philosophical knowledge was being formed, and in order to give order to it all, his treatise has to show its evolution. The science of logic emphasized later that the phenomenology justification was restrained by the concept of knowledge, for it was legitimizing the beginning of knowledge in general, the beginning of the logic. This knowledge must be reached, again, in a step-by-step way from one stage to the next. Neither an axiomatic process nor philosophy from an ultimate principle have turned out to be sufficient. So Hegel seeks to not merely assume or borrow a beginning of philosophy, but to prove one. This is the main goal of the phenomenology, the foundation of the beginning of philosophy. The structure of consciousness. What is consciousness for Hegel? To think and speak of claims to knowledge has two implications. Firstly, it demonstrates serious commitment to knowing, the decision to achieve knowledge. Secondly, it sets up the basic structure of consciousness itself. And this is, everyone differentiates themselves from something else, an object to which the knowing refers, the subject and an object. The core of this paradigm of consciousness is the relation, the duality of thought, subject, and object, or between the I and the world. The differentiation between these two instances, the two poles of the relation, makes them logically exclude or negate each other. Object means opposed, which shows the negativity of the concept and the opposition internal to consciousness. In consciousness, we have implicitly the unity of the two poles and the contradiction between the unity and the separate identities of the subject and the object. The duality, the relation, the division between thought and object, the contradiction between the two independent sides is an inherent part of consciousness and remain permanent characteristics whose dynamic must be spelled out. The object can be understood as either a given or, on the other hand, a construction. Given or construction. Object as given or construction. With regard to the given, the philosophical conception of realism, objectivism, sets a positive, affirmative sign, whereas, on the other hand, subjective idealism sets a negative one with regard to the construction. It is the other way round. So, there are two extremes. The object is outside me, immediate and given, independent of me and my knowledge, or the object is only my inner representation, my construction. In realism, the world is immediate and independent of me, while in a constructivist, subjective idealism, the I, the self, posits the world, the object. Taken in isolation, both variations are mere assumption, opinion, meaning, belief. Consciousness must sway between the two poles, oscillate between the two sides. The history of philosophy has shown this. How the dimensions of the phenomenology hang together. The three different but connected aspects of phenomenology are laid out step by step. I said consciousness counts as Geist, insofar as the latter appears or acts as relation. Phenomenon, Erscheinung in Kant, names the difference in consciousness, the relationship between thought and object. Therefore, this is a phenomenal spirit, which mainly has the status of relationality. The stations of apparent knowledge follow after each other, a different shape of Geist, and mark its movement towards itself. This is no chaotic or chronological history of intellectual forms. This is how relativity becomes the absolute, how impure knowledge becomes pure. The structure of consciousness is the path. This is another main idea in Hegel, the path from relation to self-relation, from the dualistic paradigm of consciousness to the new monistic paradigm of thought of thinking. Thought of thinking. Relativity, duality, phenomenon and imagination, like the oscillation mentioned above, are signs of skepticism. Hegel had developed the shift from self-fulfilling skepticism to the way of doubt in his engagement with the old Pyrrhonism I spoke about and the new skepticism. Dogmatism, all dogmatism presents a finite which is involved in a relation as the absolute. This claim bases itself on one pole, only on one side. But Hegel validates the other, referring to relativism, which is conscious of having its own structure of relation and opposition. Negation holds supposed one-sidedness up against duality. Consciousness is made of opposites within. Self-fulfilling skepticism leads all claims to apparent phenomenal knowledge ad absurdum, showing them each their own flip side. The self-examination of consciousness led, through determinate negation, to the self-destruction of skepticism and the dualistic structure. But just as the dual structure is abolished in the self-relation, the inclusion of dualism in monastic philosophy happens in the form of its negative free side. So the phenomenology sublates the paradigm of consciousness. The travel through the cosmos of thought to the standpoint of science, to pure comprehending thought, has not lost its fascination to this day. Even if the liberation from the traditional pattern of consciousness, the path from dualism to monism, from relationship to self-relationship, is not yet complete today. The self-examination of consciousness. Hegel obviously had a strategy from the game's opening to checkmate, in which offense and defense are in harmony and variable forms of reversal are presented. This creates, you know this, a lot of hard work for the reader of this book. It's a hard work. You know, his poetical allusions are mostly anonymous, but include such figures as Sophocles, Aristophanes, Shakespeare, Hölderlin, Schiller, etc. He also includes motifs from various world religions. And he refers to a broad range of philosophers as well. Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Spinoza, Rousseau, Hume, etc. His claim to truth implies a resolution in his simple formal structure. And this is the prelude of the self-examination and its results. Hegel's self-description of his work speaks of stations along a way. The method of execution must consist without restriction in the self-examination of the culture. This is a very main aspect here. The self, it's a self-examination of consciousness. It came not from outside, indicated by the guarantors of impartiality and lack of preconditions in terms of content. Science, scientific knowledge. Consciousness is measured by a standard it makes itself without accepting external criteria. In fact, consciousness itself is the touchstone, which cannot be given from outside. Disregarding this turns philosophy back into the dogma of presuppositions and examination into an endless rabbit hole. The key is unprejudiced comparison of consciousness with itself, immanent critique, if you will. This is Hegel's goal for immanent examination or immanent critique. That which consciousness shows to be knowledge is measured by standards which it makes itself and which are inherent to its structure. This examination involves the aforementioned differentiation, relationship, and opposition of consciousness. In this sense, consciousness is comparison, whether a thought and its opposite contradict each other, or the thought, imagination, the object, think, and vice versa. Both sides are the same insofar as they both belong to consciousness. It is this juxtaposition that consciousness represents. On the one hand, the experience of the natural, apparent consciousness, and on the other hand, the activity which insists that consciousness claim itself, are the double sequence of stages. It is based on the single-sided consciousness of oneself, which mistakes its own full consequence. Hegel repeatedly writes of forgetting, mistaking, or disappointing oneself, consciousness, or of thoughtlessness about oneself. Consciousness does not combine its two parts in strict form, but leans at one time towards the assumptions that the things are given, whether one imagines them or not, and another time towards the claim that all objects are the individual's creation. With such one-sidedness, which is contrary to its very nature, consciousness misjudges itself and falls in this thoughtlessness. This means not the negation of the principle of presuppositionlessness. Consciousness must be taken radically at its word, fulfilled accordingly, and exposed in its duality, which it always then relinquishes. Consciousness gets tossed about between two sides, which each negate an achieved shape. It experiences the relativity, the finitude, and insufficiency of each claim to knowledge. Every new claim falls to the same constant sublation, switching between presupposition and its negation. And consciousness, again, forgets its own consequence, misjudges, this is Hegel wants to show this, forgets its own consequence, misjudges the new position it generates. Relativity must be grasped That's why, as the turning upside down of consciousness itself demonstrated, the point of view of pure negativity refuses that the supposed nothingness is not the pure nothing. It's a result, it's a determination, a determinacy. Consciousness is forced to open its eyes to its own being, the duality and opposition within it. Now again, the Spinoza topos. Determination is negation, and negation is determination. The principle in Hegel's word of determinate negation, the principle whereby the full series of shapes come about by themselves. This quote from Hegel. The full series of shapes come about by themselves. The principle of a development with stringent transfers from the old to the new shape, determinate negation which comes from the paradigm of consciousness, but is mistaken, misjudged by the same. It comes from the consciousness, but is mistaken by the same. The legitimation of this fundamental logical form, determinate negation, together with Hegel's essential figure of sublation as a unity of negation, preservation and elevation, would be properly discussed later in Hegel's logic. Now a longer quote from Hegel, but it's a fundamental quote. The only thing that develops knowledge is the recognition of logical conclusions. That negation is also affirmation. Negation is determination. Or that contradictions do not result in abstract nothingness, but only in the negation of individual content. Or that such a negation is not all negation, but the negation of specific things. In other words, the result is composed of the things from which it results. End of this fundamental quote. Hegel calls this logical addition, which legitimizes itself through the structure of consciousness, the reversal of consciousness itself, whereby the series of experiences of consciousness become a way of knowing, a way of science. This argumentative passage shows that Hegel explicitly highlighted the relationship between the phenomenology and skepticism through the consideration of determinate negation, that such a shape does not represent an empty nothingness, but maintains that which was true of its previous form as well. Through this connection of the reversal of consciousness with skepticism, the latter becomes very important, the middle neuralgic turning point. In fact, skepticism is the reversal of consciousness. To accompany the self-awareness, the self-experience of consciousness, the phenomenologist, for us, presents a successive self-generation of spirit, of the pure moments of knowledge, describing what must be going on behind the back of consciousness. The ensuing forms confront the already generated structure of consciousness, showing consciousness what is had mistaken what missed, what forgotten. These steps also change the contradictory foundations of consciousness and its reversal. This thought breaks the barriers of, old Kantian thought in a revolutionary way and overcome the old paradigm which represented the apex of the unresolved contradiction of consciousness, which contains determinations of phenomenological understanding as essence of consciousness. If we picture this process as a road, a way, in Hegel, has hills to climb, dead ends, roundabouts, side alleys, and knots, and crossroads, for the paths are multiple, whether they come back together or return educated, return elaborated. If we imagine it is as a composition, the main theme is played in a variety of ways as it builds to the grand final with kettle drums and trumpets. The scenery, stage, and even the parts change, but the protagonist and its motive have been solidly laid out in the prologue. Spirit, which determines itself, comes to itself, becomes free. Spirit must come from consciousness to its own position, that of knowledge, like a cruise ship coming into his own port. Hegel smoothly leads phenomenology home to conceptual comprehensive thinking, creating a new model of philosophical thought. Certain shapes and the stringent transfers from one to another deserve particular attention. Though they are still only a few brush strokes in the big picture. For instance, how force and understanding become self-consciousness, or skepticism as the middle of the work, the chapter on reason and spirit, morality as self-consciousness, spirit, or the bridge from religion to absolute knowledge, the last furious keystone laid by this brilliant architect. These are three parts. There are three parts in the phenomenology: consciousness, self-consciousness, and reason. Three acts on this 8-scene play. In the third chapter on observing and active reason, Hegel structures Geist then as ethical, educated, and moral, as religious in its different forms, and finally as knowledge, as science, as conceptual thinking. I come here as an example of one shape to the first chapter. It's a very difficult text, but also very important chapter, the first chapter of phenomenology. In the simple, natural, basic relationship between thought and object lies a claim to knowledge in the form of immediate certainty of the object, which is only in this object itself, a knowledge of how this object itself is authentic. The content of this knowledge stems entirely from a purely other, from which the knowledge is received, natural consciousness. A predecessor of empiricism reacts to the occurrence with the senses, and in its singularity, this one, this this one bottle of water I see, the object is independent. It seems so. It seems. The object is independent, completely other as I. The many singularities in the world are given. An individual object can thus be grasped in its unchanging whole truth. This is the claim of sense certainty, the first chapter. At first, the object is essential and the subject is irrelevant. It's given. This bottle needs no knowledge from me. In this myth of the given, of which this is a minimal version, the object is regardless of whether it is perceived by the senses or not. This bottle is here also, I went out. Or if humankind is not existent. The given object only shares itself. This is a pure recording in sense certainty. Absolute certainty of the reality of the object is undeniable. This seems. There is exact spatial and temporal specificity. Here and now. Here and now. But with such forms of expression in language here and now, no object can be fixed and uniquely identified in space and time. If you have formulated the sentence, the bottle is here, the bottle was changed. Maybe in 1 second or in 5 seconds, it's not changed. No object can be fixed and uniquely identified in space and time. Here may be a house, a table, or a bottle of water. It's also here. Now may be day or night. It is not immutable but changeable, and there is no objective certainty but a subjective opinion coming from the subject and their thought. This object is because I saw it, because I know of it, see it, hear it, and so on. Absolute pure being about sense certainty as immediacy, a distinction must be made between this one as an object and this one as the thought of the self, of the I. Neither is immediate, but both, this is the goal of this chapter, neither is immediate, but both are mediated. The relation, the binary foundations of consciousness is revealed by this contradiction between immediacy and mediation. I have the certainty via an other, namely the thing, and this thing is certain via an other, namely me. So immediate knowledge has, as a concrete recording of givens in form of a permanent certainty, is in Hegel's word, the purest and most abstract knowledge, insofar as it only records the bare is, being, and consciousness appears as the pure I, meaning, not knowledge. The truth lies only in one side of consciousness, but can only be made sure of through the other side, namely an individual subject, who, however, for this kind of truth must be mere opinion, meaning, only meaning, in this difference like Plato, meaning and knowledge. It's only meaning here. The absolute independence of the external object is therefore disproved. Relativity is inherent to consciousness. A realistic principle, a realism or objectivism, which assumes the fully independent reality of object, succumbs to the objection of the relativist skeptics, who point out the multifarious nature of sensory knowledge, and who do refer to illusions in seeing, hearing, tasting. Example, maybe you know this example. One sees water in the desert, while the another does not. Is there water? So the skeptic says that such a claim tells only of the sensory experience of individuals, and the skeptic is an anti-realist position. The skeptic validates instead the second part of consciousness, consciousness itself, the subject. The importance of subject and object are now reversed, and the object becomes irrelevant. The object is because the individual subject knows it, sees it, hears it. According to Hegel, sense certainty comes back from the object to the self, to the I. Even realists acknowledge this flip side to opinion, to meaning. The thoughtlessness of consciousness becomes clear. Sense certainty and opinion, meaning, will always be confronted with the two-facedness of consciousness, so long as they lay claims to knowledge through the godly nature of language. This is a Hegel quote, the godly nature of language. One footnote, today's analytical philosophy claims that that this philosophy invented a philosophy of language. This is totally wrong. The father of a philosophy of language is Hegel in this case. The whole Phenomenology of Spirit shows this. And later in the Encyclopedia, Hegel shows this also. Jacques Derrida said Hegel is the founder of a modern theory of science and modern theory of language. This was right. This first form leads to knowledge, which turns certainty into mere opinion, meaning, and shows that essence lies neither solely in a particular object, nor in the thought of a particular I. A structure of spirit or conceptual thinking shows up here, albeit radically underdetermined, abstract, underdefined. But from the start, the book is about the phenomenology of spirit. Spirit is here. Here lies the insight that a particular individual thing is universal, that the object and the I, the self, are universal and have to be both thought of together. Every piece of paper, so Hegel, is this paper. Every eye is this eye. They are a simple combination unto themselves of many ears and eyes, a universality. The truth of sense certainty is universality. Pure being is not just immediacy, but something to which negation and mediation are inherent. Instead of knowing the immediate and this one, truth is the immediate certainty of a generality. The sentence I perceive literally means I take to be true. Consciousness always forgets this and returns to its original one-sidedness. Insofar as immediate certainty notices these things, it must be made to see its flip side. At the end of the chapter of consciousness, Hegel summarized the commonality of these forms in the result of the experience. Both the object and the thought have been negated. The truth is something other than itself. The chapter on self-consciousness presents a change of perspective, confronting the triad of object with the triad of thought. The object claims to be immediate, independent of thought, a thing in itself. Firstly, it is a one-sided being, ascertained by the senses. Secondly, it's a concrete thing to be perceived. Thirdly, there is the force of understanding. This in itself, character of the object, however, proves not to be in it at all, but outside it, as a thought, as an inner conception, firstly as meaning, secondly as perceiving, and thirdly as understanding. We have a new object now. Thought itself is the new object. The subject, the I, the self. A new form of freedom of self-consciousness is born now. So long as the object corresponds the thought and vice versa, a new shape of knowledge exists, a knowledge of oneself, an explicit self-relation, the simple and immediate structure of Geist, spirit. Hegel anticipates spirit as already having been in play. This is not a compositional change. He defines spirit and freedom and points out what these definitions are missing, points out their underdeterminate form. Conceptualizing spirit enters, so Hegel, its native realm, truth, makes consciousness into self-consciousness. Freedom is now the unity of consciousness and self-consciousness. Spirit, in Hegel, quote, is this absolute substance, is unity itself because of the complete freedom and independence of its opposite, namely different self-consciousness beings, and the unity of them. This anticipation also shows what a long way spirit still has to go before the substance can be thought of as the subject, which can be seen mainly in religion later in the phenomenon, later, where the divine is imagined as a substantial subject. In the chapters on ethical life, and he looks back at the three stages of the self-consciousness, the Stoic self, Stoicism of pure thought, the dynamic of skeptical consciousness, and the unhappy consciousness, where the sequence repeats itself at a higher level. The emphatic talk of entering into the native realm of truth rests on the fact that this self-relation, the self-reference, abolished the dualistic consciousness, the principle of dualism, and so overturns consciousness itself. Insofar as one I is the object of another and is the object of another self-consciousness, it must be both subject and object. Through this reciprocal recognition of I's, of selves, the concept of spirit with its foundational freedom comes explicitly into view for the first time. Hegel quote, I that is we and we that is I, the prefiguration of intersubjectivity. Spirit becomes clearer as protagonist of the work. The other is no longer independent, external, but objectivity is still part of self-consciousness, for otherwise it is empty and undetermined, only fixed on its identity. The old contradiction reappears in a new way in two places. It articulates the immobile tautology that I am I, the moment of abstract freedom of self-determination, unity with oneself, and the character of consciousness is unchanged, specifically the aspect of contradiction, which is the serious and replaces the void with content. A form that has remained yet is at the same time invalidated. Self-consciousness possesses a double contradiction, itself and the unchanged object. The movement leads to the sublation of the contradiction, with the goal of recognizing the identity in the non-identity. This is the contradiction of the dependent and independent self-consciousness. You know this. The road leads to a master-slave structure, a struggle for recognition, and the sublation of the contradiction in a mutual recognition between master and slave. Mutual respect of the selves, which eliminates the difference between their statuses and creates equality between them. You know, a controversial lesson, a cornerstone that is immensely important to the reception of Hegel. Reciprocal recognition leads to Stoicism, in which everyone can be oneself in thought, in self-consciousness. Two pieces of background are relevant. For Hegel, Fichte's idea of recognition and the ancient philosopher Epictetus, who as a slave gets contrasted with the other Stoic, namely the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. You have the slave, the philosopher Epictetus, and you have the master, the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, also a Stoicist. Both represent freedom of thought, Stoic freedom as self-consciousness. Whether on Hegel's quote, whether on the emperor's throne or in bondage. This unity is flawed by a new contradiction. The selves cannot thereby have full recognition. The sublation of this problem and the further reversal of the unity of the two in unhappy consciousness form the transitional stage to reason, to spirit in this strict sense. I come to the last part. I repeat some points about skepticism. A decisive stage is the involvement of skepticism in the middle of the phenomenology. The structure of self-consciousness becomes a paradigmatic fixation, as a relationship and a contradiction. Duality and relativity appear as the quintessential overturning of consciousness itself. The paradigm of self-consciousness is now in its purest form and immanent self-sublation articulates itself as the core thesis of relativism. All knowledge is relative. For every statement, its opposite is equally valid. Antinomy, you remember, antinomy is the highest form of the contradiction of consciousness, of reflecting or understanding. The superlatives, the main thesis of skepticism, are the pure, fulfilled, pure being for oneself, pure subjectivity, absolute negativity, pure self-sameness, the complete insignificance and dependence of the other. Hegel sweeps away heteronomy and master-slave structure with regards to a specific object and experiences absolute negativity. In skepticism, thought becomes something completely annihilates the multifariously defined world. All that is real, all alleged facts about the world and consciousness. An arrogant realism with its dogma of the world as a given positive is chased to hell and burns in the fire of negativity. I come to the end. Skepticism resumes the dialectical development, representing the dialectic as negative movement, and this leads to sublation of the previous stages of self-consciousness. On the one hand, the contradiction between independent consciousness of mastery and dependent consciousness of slavery. On the other hand, the sublation of Stoicism, insofar as skepticism destroys all inequality and difference. The result is a doubled phase self-consciousness, direct itself towards that which has no reality for it and belongs to that which is no being, which makes real that which has no truth for it. Similarly, empty subjective idealism falls into absolute empiricism. The door has been closed to objectivity, yet a crack has been left open. Objectivity has its edge in the external impulse of occurrences, which has been rebuffed but remains when the expression of the objective changes the foundations. Insofar as self-consciousness becomes an object, it is both I, self, and object. But the structure of consciousness is conserved in another form here. That's the problem. You have again the structure of consciousness in the form of self-consciousness. As imagination, mere certainty, no satisfactory knowledge. If self-consciousness, the unhappy consciousness, is the goal, then progress becomes way back, a regression to the principle of the object as a thing. But this way, I gave a short version, but this way only the first part of the path of phenomenology. Examples, only examples for Hegel's first part of the phenomenology of spirit. Thank you for your patience.